First of all, thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to speak to you. And also I'd like to say that I'm speaking from the land of the Binurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their connection with the land and their elders past and present. In contrast to what Ancha's just so interestingly presented to us, I'm talking here about a brand new project. I'm not talking about a record of collaboration so much as the possibilities that we see for collaborating with an ERIC in Europe. I'm planning to give you some context about the background of our project, to introduce you to how it works, its structure and its aims. Already, we do have some collaboration with the CLAR and ERIC, and I'll give you some information about that. And then I want to talk about some areas of synergy that we see as possible collaborative projects in the future. So first thing I want to talk to you about is HAS research infrastructure in Australia in its current context. The previous initiatives in this area were essentially around virtual laboratory models. A couple of ones that were in recent funding rounds were one called HONEY, which was a humanities something or other. I can never quite remember these acronyms, but it was a general humanities virtual laboratory for making connections across wide ranges of data. There was another one called Alveo, which was more in my area. I'm a linguist. This was a virtual laboratory for working with language data. Then at the end of 2020, the Australian government announced what it calls the Humanities and Social Sciences Research Data Commons and Indigenous Research Capability, which is a new initiative in this area. It's by the standards of our field, it's quite substantial funding. We don't necessarily have the big fancy machines that some of the natural science projects do, but for us, this is quite a large amount of money. And I think it represents a move to a more data-centred approach. So the 4 strands that the government has indicated they are funding are firstly our project, which they call Developing Linguistic Data Commons of Australia, then developing capabilities of the Trove platform, which is part of the National Library of Australia, an integrated social science research infrastructure, which again is about making more data available to more people, and finally the Indigenous research capability aspect. So rather than flagging an interest in platforms and tools, this is, as I said, more, I think, a data-centered approach. What's then the background of our project? Our project can be seen in some sense, I think, as a follow-on from the Australian National Corpus project, which went live in 2012. The leader of the current project, Professor Michael Hoare from the University of Queensland, was also the leader of that project. I was also involved in that project, but it was relatively small in scale. It was based around aggregating existing data. To get any kind of scale, the idea was that we would take existing collections and make them interoperable and usable together. It did succeed in generating new research, and the paper that Michael and I wrote, it's a chapter in a book at the end of last year, gives details of the kind of research that resulted from this. But we fairly rapidly became aware of a major problem, which was that we were too reliant on specifics, whether that was about funding sources or about the institutions that agreed to host the collections, or even the individuals who were needed to keep the technological infrastructure working. So this came to a kind of natural conclusion, this project. It's still sometimes accessible online, but it was clear to us that we needed to move on. And already in 2018, we'd started planning for the idea of a language data commons. We received some preliminary funding from ARDC, Australian Research Data Commons, in 2019 to develop our plans and to be well situated to move to a bigger funding source when it became available. And that happened at the end of last year. What's the structure of this project? Well, currently it's a partnership between firstly at the university level, University of Queensland and Australian National University. Then there's two big cross-university organisations that are also involved, one of which is Paradisec, which is the Pacific and Regional Archive for Digital Sources in Endangered Cultures, which is a collaboration of ANU and the University of Sydney and Melbourne. And then there's also the Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language, ARC-funded Centre of Excellence, which crosses 5 universities. So these are part of the structure. From November this year, we add some additional formal partners to the LDACA project. So the University of Sydney becomes a partner, as does Monash University, as does ARNet, as does First Languages Australia. And actually, I should have had the University of Melbourne in there. I missed it out. One institution which probably looks like it should be there, but isn't listed as a partner is IATSIS, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. They are involved. They're not a formal partner for various reasons, but they are part of consultation processes and have input to some of the work we're doing. What are the aims of the project? First, we want to create research infrastructure, a national research infrastructure based on language data. And there's various collections of data that exist which are important and which can be the basis for translational research. So that's a key aim, to make sure that this material is available in this nationally integrated structure. And then we want to ensure that people can access this material over time, can analyze it, can use it, and can do that with reasonable constraints around it. We want to make as much data as possible available to as many people as possible, but within a legally, culturally, and ethically appropriate framework. And I'll come back to that point later. So this is the background. Even in our planning phase over the last 3 years, we knew that we wanted to have Clarin ERIC involved. Clarin is, as it says on the slide, it's a mature language research infrastructure. It's been around for over 10 years. It has looked at lots of the problems which we knew we were going to encounter, and we knew that we wanted to share in the insights that they developed in that process, and also, of course, to make sure that, seeing as they're a major player in this field, that we achieved interoperability with them. So, as I said, we included the possibility of collaboration in our planning from early on. And that meant that already in 2019, we had started contacting Clarin and talking to them and trying to figure out how we could proceed. And that included a representative, which actually was myself, when going to Clarin's annual conference that year, where we had some in-principle discussions, at least. We established that the two groups were interested in collaboration. We established that certain people would be responsible for liaison, and we agreed on ongoing contact and ongoing discussion. So that got somewhat interrupted by global events last year, but it's recommenced this year. And currently, immediately, we have plans for things like joint technical workshops, and also we have a plan that the access control mechanisms we're building are based on groups who can be given access permission, and that group management can be done outside our organisation. And we see Clarin researchers, Clarin affiliated researchers, as a wonderful test case for seeing that that will work on a global scale. So these are the kinds of collaborations that we already are thinking about. But what about synergies? What can we see as possible ways in which we complement each other and can improve and enrich the work of each organisation? I'm going to talk about 3 areas which are slightly different. One is kind of very pure science based. One is moving towards more applied possibilities. And the third is more at a governance and administrative level. But I think they're all interesting possibilities. So the first one I'm going to talk about here is linguistic diversity. So there are around, depending on how you count languages, dialects and so forth, there's 6,000 to 7,000 languages spoken on this planet. Clarin has access, gives you access to data on quite a substantial subset of those. I think it's currently around 1,500 languages, but that's still like 20% of the data set. And of course, Europe is, so much of that data is from languages outside of Europe, but Clarin originates in Europe and of course has a lot of holdings of data for European languages, and Europe is not that linguistically diverse. Australia, on the other hand, sits situated in an area of really astounding linguistic diversity. So, in Australia itself, in 1788, there were at least 250 languages spoken on this continent. Sadly, very few of them are still spoken. The Pacific Southwest is an area of huge linguistic diversity also. It's the home of the Austronesian language family, which has in itself almost 20% of the world's languages. And then the island of New Guinea is also incredibly diverse, with at least 1,000 languages from a number of other language families distinct from Austronesian and distinct from Australian languages. So this is just massive diversity. Some of the data, you can get access to some data on these languages in Europe. A couple of well-known places in my field, at least, for this is Language Archive at the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen and CNRS in Paris. But, and not surprisingly for geographic reasons, there are larger holdings in Australia at places like Paradisec and Iatsis. So this is a synergy. This is and also now the Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. They've collected considerable amount of data over their lifespan. So there's a synergy here. This collaboration enlarges the database from which linguists can work on linguistic diversity and on the properties of human language. The second synergy I want to talk to you about is new varieties of language. So in Australia, we had, as I mentioned a moment ago, at least 250 Indigenous languages at the time when European presence became an ongoing phenomenon. But we've also had non-Indigenous languages which have been used in Australia now over a long period. Obviously, there's English, but there's also, for example, Irish. So a proportion of the convicts, about 30% of the convicts who came to Australia were of Irish origin, and quite a lot of early settlers were Irish as well, and many of them spoke Irish. It hasn't had a big impact on Australia, but they were there. And Chinese languages have been used in Australia since at least the gold rushes of the 1850s. So there's a history of the use of non-Indigenous languages in Australia. And some of them, particularly some European languages, have been here long enough and have been used widely enough that they've developed their own distinctive character in Australia. They've essentially become new varieties of old languages. And this is an area where there's a synergy. An example of previous collaboration in this area is in regard to German language. So German was spoken by settlers in South Australia and Victoria mainly, but from quite early, from like middle of the 19th century. My former colleague at Monash University, Professor Michael Klein, spent a lot of time studying this, and there was collaboration over the last 10 years, which means that the recordings he made of people speaking German in Australia back in the 1960s, these are now held at the Institute for Deutsche Sprache in Mannheim. So there's a history of this kind of collaboration.
Simon, this is a 5-minute warning.
Thank you. Probably the two most important languages we can think of here are Italian and Greek, large-scale migration to Australia after the Second World War. And for example, both of those languages, there are newspapers that were published weekly for over 50 years. So there's substantial quantities of data. And this data is important. And the synergies here, one is for the study of language change, so enlarging the database where we look at how languages change. That's still very pure sciencey, but there's also more applied relevance of this synergy. So for example, if you're looking to localize tools in various languages so they can be used in different places, knowing what varieties exist and how they vary is quite important. The third synergy I'm going to talk about, as I said, is more kind of abstract and administrative, and that's in the area of data governance. This is important for all the activities in the ARDC's HAS-RDC program because of the central role there of the Indigenous research capability. I think it came up in the chat in a previous session that there are specific issues around Indigenous data and how it can be made accessible or how access to it should be or could be restricted. So this is an important consideration. The Language Data Commons is committed to the FAIR principles, but we're also committed to the CARE principles, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment if you're not familiar with them. These are principles developed around Indigenous data management, but we take the approach that they're relevant in cases beyond just data from Indigenous groups. And these principles are about collective benefit, that data should be used for the benefit of the Indigenous people, that there's authority to control that data, that the people who work with the data have a responsibility to be completely transparent about what they're doing with it and how it contributes to Indigenous people's lives, and that the rights and well-being of the Indigenous group should be the primary concern, the primary ethical concern. So these are the CARE principles. As I said, they're developed around Indigenous language material, but we take the position that they're relevant for any kind of data where the originators can claim a moral right. And in the case of language data, that's quite a common situation. So that's a data governance concern, which maybe is not so much on the radar for Clarion. But on the other hand, they have expertise in other kinds of data governance issues. For example, how you handle language data under the GDPR regime. So we see that the collaboration here can lead to better data governance models for all of us, and ones which may be relevant even beyond handling language data, but we can be used to make data accessible and ethically accessible across a range of disciplines. So to conclude, we're a new initiative, but we are excited that we can learn from the experience of Clarion. And we see that there are good possibilities for both parties to benefit from this along the lines of the kinds of synergies I've just been talking about. We hope that this collaboration will become closer. We hope that we will think about formalizing this relationship at some point. Clarion already has a data center in the United States and South African organization, which is an observer. We're interested in exploring these kinds of possibilities over time. And we also think that our collaboration can be the basis for a larger group, other research infrastructures in our field, which would be interested at some point in joining in a broader grouping on a global scale. Thank you.